Հյուրեր, արգելի տեր Նիկոդից և ուսանողներ, այսօր մենք հյուր ունենք մեր ֆակուլտետում Իրաքից ժամանած ասորագետ Նիկոլաս Al-Jelooին, որին ողջունում ենք սիրով և նախև առաջ շնորհակալություն ենք հայտնում, որ պատիվ է արել այցելել մեր ֆակուլտետ և հանդես գալ դասախոսությամբ։ Դասախոսության թեման նվիրված է լինելու Ասորի, արամեացի, սիրիացի եզրերի ստուգաբանությանը հայագիտության մեջ։ Քիչ առաջ մենք մեր հյուրի հետ զրուցեցինք և պարզվեց, որ նա 3%-ով հայ է։ Մենք կլորացրեցինք, հանեցինք մինչև 15% և կարծես առարկություն չկա, այս դասից հետո այս թվում է 25-ով բան կանենք։ Կգանք ընդհանուր համաձայնության 25%-ի շուրջ։ Գիտեք, որ հայերն ու ասորիները եղբայրական ժողովուրդներ են, դարեր շարունակ իրար հետ ապրել են և բազմաթիվ նմանություններ ունեն, նաև դավանանքային առումով և տեր Նիկոդիմը, որը Հայաստանում ասորական համայնքի հոգևոր առաջնորդն է, նաև համաձայնվել է, որ եկող տարվանից մեր ֆակուլտետում դասավանդի ասորերեն։ Ես արդեն ուսանողներին տեղեկացրել եմ, որ մենք այս ուղղությունը սկսում ենք զարգացնել, նաև պարոն Դեղոնյանի աջակցությունն ենք ակնկալում և զրույցը սկսել է, այս ամբողջը սկսել է պարոն Դեղոնյանի հետ զրույցի արդյունքում և եղել է այդ տրադիցիան և մենք հիմա պետք է շարունակենք։ Եվ այսօրվա դասախոսությունը առաջին քայլն է, որը նաև փաստորեն տեր Նիկոդիմ ձեր օրհնությամբ ուրեմն պետք է հաջողությամբ սարքի։ Հարգելի մեր հյուրին ասեմ, որ ուսանողները արաբագիտության ամբիոնի 3-րդ կուրսի ուսանողներն են և ուրեմն կարծում եմ, որ նրանց մեջ կլինեն մարդիկ, որոնք հետագայում կհետաքրքրվեն ասորայության մեջ շարունակելու հարցում։ Եվ ռեգլամենտ քանի րոպե դասախոսության, каждый дакika konuşacaksınız. Ondan sonra
Kırk dakika.
40 dakika. Խառն եք լեզուները, թուրքերեն, ասորերեն, հայերեն, անգլերեն, քիչ չինարեն, բաներ ենք ասում։ Ուրեմն ռեգլամենտը հետևյալ կերպ կազմակերպենք, 40 րոպե մեր հյուրը ելույթ կունենա դասախոսությամբ անգլերեն, դրանից հետո նաև հարցեր տալու իրավունք ունեն և ուսանողներ և դասախոսներ։ Շնորհակալություն, thank you, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's an honor for the head of the faculty to be here and the head of the department, as well as Reverend Fathers and lecturers and of course students. So it's a dream for me to be here, obviously, in Armenia, in Yerevan, especially after finding out I'm a little bit Armenian. I have a great-grandfather that was Armenian. But, you know, it's special to know that the Assyrians and the Armenians have had such a long history and are so connected to each other. So to be here is like a dream, to be honest. Now, in recent years, much confusion has arisen regarding the exact meaning of the Armenian word Asori, who the term refers to, and how to translate it into English. On the one hand, we have the popular folk etymology, which links the word to the ancient Assyrians, whereas on the other hand, some academics have instead advocated that the word is the Armenian equivalent of Syrian, and therefore refers to the ancient Arameans. Now, this lack of clarity becomes even more potent when modern Armenian Christians try to navigate between the two sister churches, both of which it calls Asori in Armenian. But they have defined themselves differently in Syriac, Arabic, and English since the early to mid-20th century. So these churches are the Syriac Orthodox Church of Antioch, which uses the Western Syriac dialect as its liturgical language and is in communion with the Armenian Apostolic Church. And the other one is the Assyrian Church of the East, which uses the Eastern Syriac dialect as its liturgical language and, at least officially, is considered heretical by the Armenian Apostolic Church. Now in Arabic,
the Assyrian is considered.
the Assyrian Church of the East, yeah.
Syriac is okay.
Syriac is okay.
Yeah.
It's kosher. Yeah. So in Arabic, these churches define themselves as Suryani and Ashuri or Athuri, respectively. And in Syriac, Suryoyo and Athuraya. However, this differentiation only occurred in the early 20th century, and especially after the First World War. So you can see in English now, one church calls itself Syriac, the other one calls itself Assyrian, Suryani, Ashuri, Suryaya, Athuraya, Syriac, Assyrian in French, but in Armenian they're both called Asoraka. Right? I apologize because
it's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, it shows very.
But you see, in the early 20th century, we see that the Syriac Orthodox identified as Assyrian Apostolic or Assyrian Orthodox in English. And even now, there are some churches in America that are still called Assyrian Orthodox, not Syrian or Syriac.
But they are also different from the Assyrian.
No, they're the Western.
They are also different from Eastern Assyrian.
These are different. These are the same as this guy.
Yeah, the old one.
They're under this guy.
Yeah.
Okay, but even in Hebrew, so even in Hebrew until this name change process started happening in the mid-20th century. For example, you see in Jerusalem, the Assyrian club became the Syrian club, the Assyrian convent became now the Syriac convent. So they've been going a process of changing their name and revising history. At the same time, we see that the church that calls itself Assyrian used to call itself Syriac. So this is a book called The Paradise of Eden. It's a book of poetry from the late 13th, early 14th century. This is a manuscript from Jerusalem. You see the author of the book, who's from, I think in Armenian you call it Mitzipin, Nisibis. He calls himself Suryaya. He calls himself Suryoy, Suryaya, Syriac. Okay? What's this?
I think it's downloading still.
Downloading?
I think so.
The pictures maybe are too big. This one?
Yeah.
Oh.
Downloaded.
Next. Technical difficulties.
Maybe we go with the other version. Yeah. You just go.
Go like this.
Yeah, why not?
Awesome.
It's not so big, you can't really see.
This one.
This one.
But
Wait. You can't make it like a...
You can go from here.
So I have to change my position. That's okay. Alright. So here we also see a letter from the Church of the East from 1915. It's a bishop of the Church of the East who's actually calling it our Holy Syriac Church and describing themselves as Syriacs, Suryaya. Okay? And then in 1916 we have this letter from the Patriarch of the Church of the East. Okay, and he's calling himself Patriarch of the As-Suryaya, but the A is silent. Okay? So, East and West, for me, they're both Suryani, they're both Ashuri, they both use this name historically, they're both the same people. Now, in fact, the members of both churches are ethnically Assyrian, and they speak modern Aramaic dialects, and they both use Syriac as their liturgical language. Moreover, the terms Syria and Syrian themselves derive from the words Assyria and Assyrian, and the Syriac language is actually a dialect of Aramaic. So we can therefore see a close affinity between what is Assyrian, what is Syrian or Syriac, and also what is Aramaic. So this presentation is going to hopefully clear up some misconceptions regarding the Armenian term Asori, and how it should be interpreted in other languages through employing an interdisciplinary approach that includes empirical, linguistic, historical, and ethnographic perspectives. Now, before I go on to other stuff, I want to quickly note the writings of someone called Horatio Southgate, who was an Anglican missionary. So he was American, but he belonged to the Anglican Church, the Church of England. And he undertook a trip in May to August 1854 to northern Mesopotamia. And why it's important is because this is a year before the French and the British started to dig up Nineveh and to find the ancient Assyrian remains. A lot of scholars today say, you know, the Assyrians are not really Assyrians. They called themselves Assyrians after they found these sculptures and they found all of these things in Nineveh. But what you're going to read now is from a year before these discoveries and from very far away, because has anybody heard of Harpert?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so Horatio Southgate went to visit the Asori in Harpert, and very far, it's like 540 kilometers walking from Nineveh, and maybe 430 kilometers as the crow flies. You can see here, there's Harpert, there is the Assyrian capital Nineveh where they found all of the remains. It's not very close. He says, I began to make inquiries for the Syrians. The people informed me that there were about 100 families of them in the town of Harput and a village inhabited by them on the plain. I observed that the Armenians did not know them under the name which I used, Syrian, but called them Asori, which struck me the more at the moment from its resemblance to our English name Assyrians, from whom they claimed their origin. Now this is important. Nineveh had not been discovered yet, and the Syriac Orthodox of Harpert were saying, we are the sons of Ashur, we are Assyrian. Okay? Or Asur.
Ashur or Asur, yes.
Who built Nineveh. So here you see a picture of Horatio Southgate, and you see another quotation. Their common language is Turkish, and it is from there that Athur of Arabic and Syriac becomes Asur, and the Athuri of Arabic becomes Asuri in Turkish. Now, the classical Armenian online.
This is 19th century.
That's 1841.
Yeah.
Now, the classical Armenian online base form dictionary belonging to the University of Texas at Austin's Linguistics Research Center defines Asori as Assyrian or Syrian, and it's based on 5th century Armenian texts by Kocharyan the Iberian and Moses of Horeb. So those who compiled this online dictionary have not given another word to mean Assyrian. They don't say that this can't mean Assyrian and something else has to mean. They say it means both, Assyrian and Syrian.
Not Syria.
Syrian and Syria, I'm going to explain. So, it is therefore clear that the 5th century definition of what Syrian meant, which is different to what Syrian means today, has to be taken into consideration to avoid hindsight bias. So, then you have another online dictionary, this time of Western Armenian, by the Collège Dictionnaire Mashtots France, and it defines Asorakan as the adjective Assyrian, Asoreren as the noun or adjective Syriac, Asori as meaning Syriac of Assyrian origin. No other word for Assyrian is given, and Syriac is not linked to the ancient Arameans. On the other hand, the English version of the same dictionary from the same website defines Asorakan, Asori, and Asoreren all as Assyrian, not even as Syrian or Syriac. So, as for Wiktionary, I know a lot of people might be using Wiktionary. It defines Asori as a Syriac speaker or a Syriac, Syrian, member of an ethno-religious grouping indigenous to Syria and Mesopotamia, practicing various forms of Syriac Christianity and speaking Neo-Aramaic languages, historically also Classical Syriac, now variously identifying as Syriac, Aramean, Chaldean, or Assyrian. Furthermore, we see that the Russian word, which is no longer used, Isor, comes from the Armenian word Asori, and that's what they used to define us in the Russian Empire during the 19th century. Now, on the other hand, the entry's authors admit that the word ultimately derives from the Akkadian deity, city, and land name Ashur via the Parthian Asor. And then also we have words like Asoraren for the Assyrian language, and by extension Assyriology is called Asoriologia, etc. Now, in other dictionaries we additionally find the words Asorots to mean of the Syrians, or Asoraban to mean a Syriacist or a scholar of Syriac studies. Now, this phenomenon of calling Asori, or of defining Asori as Assyrian, is not a modern one and can be found in the earliest dictionaries of the Armenian language. In 1633, this Armenian language dictionary by Italian Armenologist Francesco Rivola from the Ambrosian school in Milan translated Assyrian or Syrian as Asori, and the plural form as Asorik. He also included the alternative spelling Asuri, meaning Assyrian or Syrian. So you see, Asori and Asuri. They both mean Assyrian. And he translated the Assyrian or Syriac nation, Generatio Assyria vel Syriaca, as Asorot's Azg. Okay? Yeah. Which, while Assyria, the country, is rendered as Asoristan, and the Syriac language is Asorere. Now, his main source was the vocabulary of Julfa Armenian merchants whom he knew personally, and which is why the dictionary is more colloquial than written and contains important material for studying the history of the Armenian language's development. Now, next one. In his 1695 Latin Armenian dictionary, the Armenian Catholic bishop of Lviv, Astvatsatsur Nersisyan, who lived practically his entire life in the Ukraine, defined Asori, Asoristansi, Asoristana Tvoi as Assyrians. Right? He also defined Asoristan as Assyria, Asoristani as Assyrian, Asoristanoren, interesting, and Asoren as the Assyrian language. On the other hand, he defined Syria or Syrian as Syriai, Asorii, and Aramean. He defined Syriac as Asori and Asoroi, and Syriac as Asoreren, and Syrian as Asori, Asoroi, and Aram. So there's a link there somehow. In his 1714 Latin Armenian dictionary, French Jesuit and Armenologist Jacques Viot, who spent many years as a missionary among Armenians in Persia, the Caucasus, and the Ottoman Empire, translated Assyrian as Asori, Asorestoniaik, and Asur, and Assyria as Asoristan or Asorestaniaik. Also, Yerkir Asorestaniaits, okay, Assyrian country. On the other hand, he translates Syriac, there. Yes. He translates Syriac as Asori, and Syria as Yerkir Asorwots, which is the same thing, right? Syriai Asorik. And he defines the Syriac language as Asoreren. So notably, this dictionary is rich in idioms and phrases, as well as colloquial and dialectal words and grammatical explanations, making it also a valuable resource for the Armenian language of the period. So there is a clear link, therefore, between the words Syriac, Assyrian, and even Aramaic in the Armenian point of view, which considers them actually as synonyms. In fact, Armenians and their literature rarely, if at all, distinguish between Assyrians and Syriacs, calling them both Asori, since they already know that they are the same people. This is because in ancient times, the modern area of Syria was considered an integral part of the Assyrian Empire, which was the first Middle Eastern state or people whom the Armenians' ancestors came into contact with. Armenian history books, beginning from those composed in the 5th century, thus have several stories or legends that describe Assyrians, such as the story of Asori Takavor, Bel, and the Armenian king Hayk Nahapet, the archer, as well as Asori Takuhi Shamiram, the Assyrian queen Semiramis, who fell in love with the Armenian king Ara the Beautiful, Ara the Fair. Often, therefore, when a Western Armenian would meet an Assyrian that speaks Armenian, the conversation would obviously be in Armenian, and then somehow it would lead to the story of Shamiram and Ara, and they would say, oh, Tsera Sorita Fuhin Shamirama Sirets Mer Ara Right? Now, so I'll just translate. Your Assyrian queen Semiramis loved our Armenian king Ara the Fair. It should be stressed here that Shamiram was never called Asorestansi. And she was clearly known as an Assyrian queen using the adjective Asori. She is never described as being Syrian or Aramean. And we also know that her character is actually based on a real historical Assyrian queen called Shamuramat. So she existed, which means Ara probably also existed.
Yes. And she didn't give up.
No. On the other hand, revisionist scholars who wish to attack the Assyrian identity argue that the definition of Asori is, as Assyrian, is just a personal interpretation by people who don't have any knowledge of the Armenian language. They therefore assume that this perceived misconception is based solely on the word's similarity to Turkish Asuri and Arabic Athuri or Ashuri, which mean Assyrian. Because modern Assyrians, as we shall see, designate themselves using the colloquial term Suraye or Suroye and the classical appellation Suryaye or Suryoye, a silent or lost A, which I've shown, is often added at the beginning of these words in order to equate them with these terms, but to demonstrate their etymology. Now, the late Professor Wolfhard Heinrichs called this a very ingenious but simply naive hypothesis, facilitating only the claims of nationalists. Rather, such people would prefer to see the word Asori as referring to the ancient people of geographical Syria, today's Syria, which means the Arameans, who were called Syrians by the Romans. So as shall be discussed in more detail further on, this idea derives from the fact that the Septuagint, or the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, translates the words Aram and Arami into Syria and Syrian, which is in Armenian Asoric and Asori. This is because at the time during which the Septuagint's translation work was undertaken in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, the historical Aramean homeland, which existed some centuries earlier, was represented by the Seleucid rump state of Syria, which later became a Roman province. Moreover, since the original Hebrew text was written down, the Arameans had undergone a process of cultural assimilation into the Assyrian Empire, at the same time as the Assyrians had gradually adopted the Aramaic language as their lingua franca. We therefore see a very unprecedented merger between the two peoples, where the Arameans adopted the Assyrian political and cultural identity, while the Assyrians linguistically became Aramaic speakers. So the Armenians and others could no longer distinguish between who was Syrian or Syriac and who was Assyrian. However, the Armenian language, let me show you. So this is an online Bible. This is the link to the online Krapar Bible printed in 1895 in Polis, Constantinople. And you can see, for example, Asor. It'll tell you how many times it occurs in the text, okay? And it'll give you exactly where in the Bible it is.
So Asuri and Asori basically are the same, more
Basically. We'll see here, for example, here you see Asor, right? You see in the Hebrew Bible they have Ashur and Ashuri. So for people to say that Asori only means Syrian or Aramean is incorrect, because the Armenian Bible actually uses Asori to refer to the ancient Assyrians, not just Asoristansi. And you even have the different word forms. So Asoriats, Asoriatsen, Asori, Asorin, Asoris, etc., etc. And it's all translated. It gives you the definition in English as Assyrian.
Basically, these are inflections. Just
Exactly. And then you have Asorian as Syriac. And then this is Asur. They also have Asur, which occurs in the Bible. Now, let me show you. Here you see Judith. See the book of Judith, and it has Asur. But then the book of Judith again has Asurai and Asur. It's the same.
Yeah.
It's the same. Because in the book of Judith, you know the story, there's this Assyrian general, Holofernes, general of the Assyrian king Nebuchadnezzar. She goes in, she cuts his head. It's an interesting story. If you have some time, read it. So, in Armenian, there actually are words for Aramaic. Okay, it does have a separate word. So, an Aramean is an Arameatsi. The adjective Aramean or Aramaic is Arameakan, while the Aramaic language is called Aramean or Yerevan. Interestingly, some dictionaries define this as meaning Old Asorakan, Mesopotamian or belonging to northern Mesopotamia, and we all know historically northern Mesopotamia is Assyria. Now this word Aram is actually in opposition to another Armenian adjectival noun, Aramean, meaning Armenians belonging to or originating from the generation of Patriarch Aram. The father of Aram, I think, or the grandfather of Aram. And it's also used to refer in one place to a grammar of the Armenian language. So, Asori and Asoristansi. As already noted, there's been a recent push by some revisionist scholars to create a distinction between the terms Assyrian and Syriac by creating an artificial linguistic difference between Asoristansi and Asori in Armenian. In this way, they are now saying that in Armenian, an Assyrian is called an Asoristansi. Therefore, Asori does not mean an Assyrian, but rather a Syriac person or Aramean. In Armenian, however, an Asoristansi is simply someone from an independent Assyrian state. Just like an Assyrian from the modern Republic of Armenia would simply be called a Hayastansi. Since Assyrians have no country of their own, they are known by their ethnic name as Asoriner, in a similar way to how Armenians, who are not from the Republic of Armenia and who do not hold citizenship, are simply called Hayer. They're not Hayastansi. Furthermore, in English, these definitions do not make sense because linguistically and grammatically, the word Syriac just means language of Syria, and not even Syria, late antique Syria. Okay? So the word can only be used to denote a language. It cannot be used to refer to a person or to a group of people. Calling someone a Syriac is like calling someone an Arabic. Anybody that knows English knows that doesn't make sense. And calling a group of people the Syriacs is like calling people the Arabics. It sounds ridiculous, it doesn't make sense, and above all, it is grammatically incorrect. Never mind that in Armenian, a language is denoted by the suffix eren. So the translation of the word Syriac in Armenian can only be Asoreren. Can't be Asori. Now, let us delve into the geographical term Asorestan itself and look at its deeper meaning. while it indisputably refers to the ancient state of Assyria in northern Mesopotamia, we need to look closer at its etymology and history. The word appears to have been wholly borrowed from Middle Persian Asoristan or Asuristan, which was the official name of the important province of Babylonia under the Sassanid Empire, and was used by the Parthians before that. Now, nevertheless,
Can I ask a question? How do they identify themselves, the East, the Syria?
I'm going to go to that. It's part of the paper.
Yeah.
You're on my wavelength. So this word, okay, Asoristan or Asuristan, just means land of the Assyrians. Okay, so it was formed in Armenian as Asori Astan, with the sound Ia, Asori Astan becoming Asoristan. So from this we have the adjectival noun Asoristansi and etc. It is analogous to the word Hayastan, okay, which comes from Hay Astan, land of the Armenians. Okay? So in this case of the Assyrians, therefore, if Asori does not mean Assyrian, then how could Asuristan mean Assyria? And if Asuristan means land of the Assyrians, then how can Asori mean anything except Assyrian? Thus, if Asori meant Syrian, or by extension Aramean, why would the Armenians not use that word and rather the term Aramestan? You know, some questions. I asked them. So let's talk about Asorik and Asuristan. Okay? Now, in opposition to Asuristan, classical Armenian confusingly uses the word Asorik to mean the country of the Asori nation, and more specifically, the area in the west of Mesopotamia and present-day Syria. Now, this had led many scholars to thus translate Asorik to mean Syria, as opposed to using Asuristan for Assyria. In fact, Asorik is just the old Armenian plural form of Asori, and is analogous to the term Hayk when it's used as, for example, Medzhayk, Greater Armenia, Medzasorik, right? In fact, the word only came to be used in the 3rd century AD after the Assyrians had lost their sovereignty and the Persian and Roman client kingdoms of Adiabin and Osrhoene came to be integrated into those respective empires. On the other hand, a new word was coined in the 20th century to distinguish this medieval definition and the modern facts on the ground. In Eastern Armenian, the modern state of Syria is called Syria, okay, Syria. Western Armenian, Surya. The adjectival noun is Syriai or Syriatsi. The adjective is Syriakan. And someone that studies the modern Republic of Syria would be a Syriaban or a Syriagit. This is because the Armenians knew that the Asoriner of Asorik were Aramaic-speaking Syriac Christians, but the modern people of the Republic of Syria are Arabic-speaking and Muslim. So that's why they made the distinction in Armenia. So on the other hand, an Armenian from the Arabic Republic of Syria would be a Syriakanhai, right? But not an Asurakanhai. No, because that would mean Assyrian Armenian. In parallel to this, the Asoriner themselves, whether Eastern or Western, have thus preferred to use the terms Assyrian, Syriac, or even Aramean to distinguish themselves from the Syrian Arabs. That's why we no longer call ourselves Syrians. Never mind the fact that the geographical name of Syria is based on the Seleucid rump state that formed in the 2nd century BC after it lost its territories in Mesopotamia and further to the east to the Parthians. So that's what it used to be, you see all that. And then it just became that bit there. Okay? Now, prior to this, the Hellenistic kingdom of Syria, the Seleucid kingdom of Syria, had stretched from the Mediterranean eastward into Persia and perceived itself as the successor of the Assyrian and Babylonian empires. You can see it covers the same area. Okay? Now, in modern times, political movements such as the Syrian Social Nationalist Party has also advocated for this idea of a great Assyria built on the idea of the Assyrian Empire's territories. So, interestingly, modern Eastern Armenian has also created new words for Assyria, such as Assyria and Assyriatsi, but these are very rarely used. Very rarely used. No one uses them really.
To Assyria, to ancient Assyria, or to ancient Antioch? It's the
For
same.
the ancient Assyrians. So, what do the
Can you someone who doesn't know Aramean? Assyrian?
Yeah,
Copying from Russian rather than...
probably.
Or maybe spoken.
No, I think it's what the professor said. So, what do the Asoriner actually call themselves? That's the question you asked.
Yeah.
So we have so far determined that Asori is used in Armenian to refer to ethnic Assyrians, including Syriacs, and those churches which use the Syriac language as their liturgical language. Now, we see that the term Suryani is an Arabic word of Persian derivation from the word Asurian or Suryan, meaning Assyrians or Syrians. And this is also used in Turkish. Already in the middle of the 5th century AD, the terms Asuri and Asurian and Asurestan had dropped the initial A vowel and become Suri, Suryan, and Surestan. While when the Arabic Islamic armies conquered, yeah, like that. When the Islamic Arab armies conquered Mesopotamia in the 7th century, they found the Christian people, whom the former Persian Sassanid rulers called Suryan. And then they adopted the word Suryan as the plural in Arabic. Okay? So they adopted the word Suryan and Suryani, meaning one person, that is Suryan. After founding the Ottoman Empire around 1300 and conquering the areas where these Christians lived in the 16th century, the Turks adapted these terms to Suryani, one, and Suryaniler, plural. Now, in contrast, Aramaic speakers belonging to the different Syriac churches, where am I, have their own nomenclature for themselves. The adherents of the Assyrian Church of the East, Ancient Church of the East, and Chaldean Catholic Church, who speak Eastern dialects of Assyrian Neo-Aramaic, call themselves Suraye, Suirai, Sure, and their language Surit, Surat, Suras, etc. Depending on which dialect they speak. There are many local dialects.
The ones that we regard heretics, our church.
Yes. So, that's Eastern, this is Western. Okay? So, those who refer to the classical Syriac, which to the Assyrians is what Grapar is to the Armenians, as their literary standard, they use the term Suryaya, or Syrian, for both the group identity and the language. As already mentioned, since the late 19th century, these terms have often been both written with or without the silent initial A. On the other hand, the adherents of the Syriac Orthodox and Catholic churches who speak the Western dialects of Assyrian Neo-Aramaic call themselves Suroye, and their language Surate. They use the same word, they just pronounce it differently. In a similar manner, when they use classical Syriac, they call themselves Suryoye, for both the group identity and the language. As you may notice, the main difference between Eastern and Western dialect groups is the vowel system, whereas the difference in Armenian is the consonants, d, t, k, g, but in Syriac it's a-o, mostly. So hence they use the same endonyms and have the same basic identity as each other. When we look at what the name Suraya means, this is a dictionary from 1900 by the Chaldean bishop Jacob Eugene Manna, and he says that Suraya means Suryani, Arami, Nasrani, Ikhtisar, As-Suraya, or Athoraya. That's it.
Yeah, that's it.
There's no other thing to say. So,
So big compliment.
Yeah. And look, when we look at the language, we say that the word Suraya comes from Ashuraya. Ashuraya became Asurayu, Surayu, Suraya. Right? And when we look at the language, Surit, Lishanum Asuritum to Asuritum, Suritum, Surit. So it's a basic development of the same word. Now, the fact that Assyrian and Syrian are synonymous in classical Greek and Latin texts has already been well established by late Harvard professor Richard Fry, and this was then confirmed as being a much older phenomenon by Austrian archaeologist Professor Robert Rollinger, using the bilingual Luwian and Phoenician inscription from Çineköy near Adana in Turkey as his evidence. In it we see that the Phoenicians, in Phoenician, what is called Ashur, in Luwian is called Sura. And we know from other sources, for example, that the Egyptians called the Assyrians Iswer. Now to add to this, I talked about the shift from Ashurayu to Surayu, and that was posited by Professor Simo Parpola. He's an emeritus professor from the University of Helsinki in Finland. So, on the other hand, Aramaic was introduced as the Assyrian Empire's second official language in the 8th century BC, and was used as a lingua franca by them until the fall of their empire in 621 or 612 to 608. Significantly, everywhere that Aramaic had spread in the Middle East and was spoken as a native language corresponds exactly with the boundaries of the ancient Assyrian Empire. So hence, Aramaic, while not Akkadian, which was the original language used by the Assyrians, is an Assyrian language and is not separate to their identity. Furthermore, Syriac is a dialect of Middle Period Aramaic from northern Mesopotamia, historic Assyria, which adds to the fact that it is Assyrian. Hence, there are no separate Assyrian and Syriac languages or identities. They are one and the same, and in fact, dialects of the same Aramaic-Assyrian dialect continuum. Now, as demonstrated, the Aramaic-speaking members of the Syriac churches from northern Mesopotamia constitute one and the same nation or ethnic group. As such, they have had the same term which they traditionally used to describe themselves, Suraye or Suroye, and we've talked about it deriving from the Akkadian term Ashuraye. Moreover, the dialects of Aramaic spoken by them come from the same area, they're all linked with each other, they're called Surit or Surait, and they come from the Akkadian term Asuritu. And then, with the Syriac language that they use, even though they have different scripts, but it's the same alphabet, and obviously we talked about the difference between the vowels. Now I'm going to talk about why these people see themselves as different and why they're confusing other people to think that they're different. And then I'm going to come to my conclusion. So I'm not far, I'm almost there. So why are the same people being divided into Ashuri and Syriani, which are perceived as not exactly being the same? This boils down to sectarian church divisions and Middle Eastern secular politics. As mentioned above, the Assyrians have two main dialects, Eastern and Western. Most Eastern speakers belong to Syriac churches with their roots in the Church of the East, also known pejoratively as Nestorian, while most Western speakers belong to Syriac churches with their roots in the Syriac Orthodox Church of Antioch, also known as Jacobite. Because the Eastern Assyrians were in the Parthian and later Sasanian Empire, Persian Empire, and the Western Assyrians were in the Roman and later Byzantine Empire, they developed distinct dialects and separate liturgical traditions and practices. In the 5th century, they adopted opposing forms of Christology due to the political situation in their time. So they parted ways and became separate churches with people of the same ethnicity using the same language. In addition, they became rivals and condemned one another as heretics. Later on, in the 15th to 18th centuries, the Syriac Orthodox, who became Catholic, were called Syriac Catholics, whereas those from the Church of the East who became Catholics were distinguished by Rome as Chaldeans, Chaldeat Siner, even though their liturgical language is Syriac, in order to tell them apart from the Syriac Catholics. Now this is because the Eastern dialect of Syriac or Aramaic was incorrectly referred to as being Chaldaic. It's an outdated term which was only used by Western scholars in the Middle Ages. Now these Uniate churches also condemn the churches that they come out from as being heretical, which is funny. Everybody's condemning everybody. Okay, everybody's a heretic. Now let's fast forward to the 20th century and the aftermath of the Assyrian genocide. At the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, the Syriac Orthodox clergy were demanding a state for the ancient Assyrian people. And there was even a united Assyro-Chaldean delegation there demanding for the same thing. Since the late 19th century, many Syriac Orthodox activists in the Middle East and the diaspora were openly identifying as Asori, in addition to Syriani and Aramean, which to them all meant the same thing and referred to the same people. The Assyrians were denied a state, however, and were relegated to being a protected Assyro-Chaldean minority in a future independent Kurdistan at Sev, and then forgotten altogether at Lausanne in 1923. As a result, the hierarchies of the Syriac Orthodox, Syriac Catholic, and Chaldean Catholic churches became jaded with Assyrian nationalism, which was perceived as a separatist threat by the newly formed Arab and Turkish nation states. The Church of the East, with its patriarchate, continued to lobby for an Assyrian state or autonomous region within Iraq, and increasingly came to be identified with the Assyrian identity solely, which further sparked the sectarian rivalry of the Syriac churches that condemned it as being heretical. Now, in August 1933, the army of the newly independent Arab state of Iraq massacred 3,000 Assyrian civilians from the Church of the East, in and around a town in the north of the country called Simain. After that, the rift grew wider, and the other churches officially left the Assyrian identity in the lap of the Church of the East. So they started to pursue other identities, such as Syriac, Chaldean, Arab Christian, or even Aramean. This was again due to fear of being perceived as belligerents by the nation states that they lived in as minorities, but also in order to maintain their privilege as representatives of their respective communities, turning their churches into separate religious nations. Since then, no, this is in Jerusalem. That's the Church of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. But see, this is a procession from the Church of the East, and you have the Assyrian flag and the flag of the Assyrian Church of the East. So since the 1930s, basically, it has only been the Church of the East, with its old and new calendar branches, that has openly endorsed the Assyrian identity, while rejecting all others, including, unfortunately, Syriac. This is why now there is such a perceived difference between who is an Ashuri, or who is Assyrian, and who is a Syriani, and who is Syriac, even though originally and historically, all these terms meant one and the same thing. Now I'm going to give you an analogy. With the Armenians, I'm going to use the Armenians for an analogy. Now, we know that there are two distinct Catholicosates in the Armenian Apostolic Church, and two dialect groups, Eastern and Western. The Catholicosate which most Eastern Armenians adhere to is Echmiadzin, and that which mostly Western Armenians adhere to is Antelias, or Kilikia. Even though they are united in liturgical language, krapar, liturgical practice, material culture, and Christology, They maintain distinct hierarchies, and many diaspora Armenians are divided between diocese, Echmiadzin, and prelacy, or Antelias jurisdictions. On the other hand, Armenian Catholics are united in one church, since there is no liturgical or Christological distinction between those that left Echmiadzin or Antelias's jurisdiction to convert to Catholicism. But imagine if there was a distinction. Imagine if Echmiadzin and Antelias developed opposing Christologies, liturgical practices, and became separate rival churches and condemned each other as heretics. Imagine if one Catholicosate, due to political reasons in the 20th century, adopted the traditional endonym Haykakan, whereas the other one, in opposition to it, adopted the term Armenakan. And then they later developed into two separate Catholic churches as a result, with one Catholic church calling itself Haykakan and the other one calling itself Urartakan. Now, would these Armenian-speaking Haya, Armener, and Urartsiner now be considered separate peoples or nations? I don't think so.
Politically, maybe, but not in reality.
Exactly. So this is precisely the situation that the Assyrians, the Asoriner, are finding themselves in today, and why many scholars and ordinary people are so confused. So, this should be there. Anyways, in Armenian, the stateless Christian Assyrians are called Asoriner. So, no, I've got to be here. From Asur, the father of the Assyrians, who was the son of Shem and grandson of Noah. Asori can also mean Syrian in the context of Greater or Late Antique Syria, which covered the same area as the Assyrian Empire, but not Levantine Syria or the modern Arab Republic of Syria. The feminine of this is Asoruhi. The Old Armenian plural is Asorik. In addition, sometimes used for Western Mesopotamia and Levantine Syria as opposed to Greater Assyria or Asoristan, which was the Assyrian Empire or state. The gentilic forms of Asori used to describe the Syriac churches or Assyrian land or Asorakam and Asorots, and both the Syriac and Assyrian languages are in Armenian called Asoreden. Furthermore, a person from the ancient Assyrian Empire or a hypothetical Assyrian state, if there was one today, would be called an Asoristansi. And they would not necessarily be of Assyrian ethnicity. Whereas classical Armenian does not distinguish between Assyria and ancient or late antique Syria, it does clearly distinguish between, it does not distinguish between the terms for Assyrian, Syrian, Assyrian language and Syriac, or even Aramean or Aramaic. So the modern Armenian terms, as we've seen for Syria, are Syria, Syriaci or Syriakan, and well, we know that in Syria they speak Arab, but if they speak their own language, what would it be? Syriac? No.
Hypothetically, yes.
Hypothetically,
yes.
If Syrian dialect one day.
And then you see the parallels in Armenian, which I don't need to go through, right? But what I'm relying on is actually these should be the same. You can't say an Asori is an Aramean, but an Astoristansi is an Assyrian, and they're not the same thing. You can't. So, would you distinguish between a Hay and Hayastan? Of course. Because the first refers to an ethnic Armenian residing anywhere in the world, and the second refers specifically to a citizen of the Republic of Armenia. They don't need to be ethnic Armenian. So for example, Terhayat is Hayastansi Asori, right? But Hayastan means land of the Hayat, the legendary descendants of Hayk Nahapet, doesn't it? So this is exactly the same distinction between Asori and Asoristansi. The first refers to an ethnic Assyrian residing anywhere in the world, and the second refers to someone from the ancient Assyrian Empire or a hypothetical Assyrian state, the land of the Asoriner, legendary descendants of Asur. Here is another thing to think about. If Asori means Syrian or Aramean and not Assyrian, then if the Assyrian were ever to gain their own independent state sometime in the future, would it not be called Asuristan, land of the Assyrian? As for the language, if the Assyrian are not Assyrians, and this English term is only represented in the Armenian language by Asoristansiner, then what language did the Asoristansiner speak if it was not Asorere? Was their language Asoristanere?
No.
No.
It could be
It's-
Akkadic.
Well,
It could be Akkadic if it exists.
exactly,
Now.
exactly. But is there a higher Stanere?
No.
No. Okay? So these are just some questions which rely on logic. Okay? So, these are some words which I've created in Armenian. Now, I address these questions that I mentioned to those Asoratiansner or the Hakasorakanner who are trying to distort linguistic and historical facts regarding the Assyrian people and confuse those Armenian academics and scholars who want to conduct serious research in the fields of Syriac or Aramaic studies. I understand that Orthodox Armenians are in religious communion with the Syriac Orthodox Church, which, since the 1930s, has grown into an institution that distances itself from the Assyrian identity and is even at times openly and aggressively anti-Assyrian. I understand that the Armenian Apostolic Church wants to humor its friends and its allies in the Syriac Orthodox Church and not offend them. But you can only go so far in doing that and in distorting the truth. At any rate, I would like to share this table of Armenian words relating to the Assyrians which I have prepared, many of which I could not have found in any dictionary, but I have formed based on corresponding entries relating to Armenia and Armenians. And I'm opening the floor to my Armenian and Armenian-speaking friends in the audience, to all Asora Serner. What do you think? I know I'm not a native Armenian speaker, but do I have a point here or not? I would truly welcome your input. Thank you very much.
Very informative,
Informative.
engaging, and insightful. Thank you. Really.
And maybe we'll have a question from the professor.
First of all, thank you very much. Because the confusion is this, almost in all the languages, but in Armenian it is even more. Because in all the terms we use always at the beginning we have A, the letter A.
Yes.
So it is always exists.
Yes.
While in English and other languages you can more or less differ. I'm not sure that the students completely understood everything, but you have given a formula during the paper which explains much easier everything. You said that there was an expression. You said that between Mesopotamia and Syria, let's say Mesopotamia, not
The Levant.
we can say Assyria, but
Okay.
I prefer to say Mesopotamia and Syria. Politically, Mesopotamia was dominated,
Yes.
while the language of Syria dominated Mesopotamia.
Yes.
This is I think the best, more simple and best explanation.
Precisely.
Isn't it?
Yes.
So there was a fusion.
There was a
But
fusion.
we still have a distinction between Syria politically and Asoric,
Yes.
but not religious divisions. We don't go into
No.
that. You are the same. That's the message.
Right. Yeah.
Great. That was great. I have been wondering about this question for already